I had just come back after several weeks in the hospital when I saw that the workshop door had a new lock. The tools of my entire lifetime were gone. My father's keepsakes and my wife's sewing machine were missing too, and my daughter-in-law stood in the room that used to be the woodshop, now covered with foam mats, cameras mounted, and a sign reading, "Nap time," smiling as she said they needed the space for the baby, convenient and reasonable. My son looked away and then dropped a sentence so cold it went numb. "You don't use that stuff anymore, Dad. If you're listening, leave a dot and tell me where you're hearing this story from. And if you believe there are boundaries no one is allowed to cross, subscribe to the channel so I know I'm not telling this story in silence." I got home close to noon after a long drive that felt like it would never end. My house is in Cary, a suburb of Raleigh in Wake County. After the engine shut off and the heat was still rising from the hood, I sat there for a few more beats to steady my breathing. For weeks, I had been with my brother in the hospital, running back and forth between the operating room, the hallways, and my sister-in-law's small kitchen, trying to keep everything from slipping out of my hands. His heart surgery was over, his heartbeat stable, his color better, and I thought I could come back, sleep in my familiar house, brew a cup of coffee like every morning before. I pulled my bag down, closed the car door, and walked around the side of the house out of old habit. The narrow path leading to the workshop was still there. The wooden fence I built myself years ago not yet rotted, the gravel crunching underfoot just as I remembered. I reached for the door and tried to open it. The handle didn't budge. I bent down, looked closer, and saw the thing that made my heart seize. A brand new, shiny lock dangled from the latch. Not mine, not the kind I ever used. I couldn't remember buying it, because I never had. The key I carried was useless, of course. I tried again, gently, then harder, as if the door would understand and open out of recognition of its owner. It stayed still. I stood there for a moment, eyes fixed on the lock, my mind blank. The first feeling wasn't anger, and not quite fear either. It was like missing a step on the stairs, your stomach dropping, your heart racing, and then slowing. I stepped back half a pace, took a deep breath, and walked around to the side window. It was low, a window I used to slide long boards through for convenience. I placed both hands on the sill and leaned in to look through the glass. Inside was brightly lit. The light I always turned on when working late shone straight onto a space so empty it felt cold. Empty, not tidy, not partially cleared, completely wiped clean. My father's workbench, the oak table he built in the 1960s, was gone. The tool rack, once holding every wrench, drill bit, and hammer, had been taken down, leaving bare screw marks on the wall. The old lathe, so heavy it once took 3 men to move, was no longer in its place. In the left corner, where Helen had kept her sewing machine for decades, there was now only a stretch of bare concrete floor. I lifted my hand to the glass, as if I could touch what was no longer there. My chest tightened. The sounds around me faded away, leaving only the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Helen passed away 2 years ago, but I had kept her sewing corner exactly as it was, as if she had only just lifted her foot from the pedal. I remembered the smell of machine oil, the scent of new fabric, the steady rhythm of the needle. All of it had been taken while I was gone, as if someone had lifted an entire part of my life out, set it somewhere else, and then locked the door. I straightened up and turned toward the back door. The key still turned smoothly. The kitchen opened up, familiar. The small dining table, the refrigerator with reminder notes stuck to it, the wall clock ticking steadily. I stood at the doorway, not stepping fully inside. The room in front of me was no longer the place I knew. The first thing that caught my eye was the pale foam flooring, thick and soft, covering the concrete floor that used to be icy cold every winter morning. On the ceiling, a baby monitor camera hung angled toward the corner. Its black lens pointed straight at a white crib pressed against the wall. The lights were brighter than usual, even and gentle. the kind of lights people use for small children. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, not yet faded, sharp and sweet at the same time. I took another step. The foam sank slightly under my feet. On the wall, a plastic board hung neatly, written in colorful markers. NAP time, feeding, play. The handwriting was rounded and orderly, like a schedule that had already been carefully planned. The corner of the room where my lathe once stood was now a shelf stacked with diapers, wet wipes, and baby bottles, lined up in rows. I recognized the rocking chair immediately. Old wood, armrests worn smooth by time. It used to be in my mother's house. I don't remember anyone asking me before bringing it here. There was the sound of a spoon tapping against a bowl. I took 2 more steps and saw my son sitting there. Evan sat at the table in his t-shirt, pajama pants, and a bowl of cereal in front of him. He ate while scrolling on his phone, looking like any ordinary morning. When he saw me, he looked up and gave a casual smile. "You're back early, Dad," he said. "I thought you'd stay a few more days." I set my bag on the floor and leaned against a chair. I looked at him a moment longer than necessary. 35 years old, still eating breakfast as he did back in school, still sitting the same way, one leg hooked over the opposite chair, that strangely unbothered air. I didn't beat around the bush. "Where's my workshop stuff?" I asked. He blinked, looked at me, then back at the screen, as if the question could wait. "Melissa knows," he replied. "She's upstairs." I turned when I heard footsteps. Melissa stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach, the other gripping the doorframe as if she needed the support. She looked at me, measuring, then offered a thin smile. "We need the space," she said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "The baby's coming soon." I looked at her, then back at the room. I tried to find some old trace, something left behind to prove this place had once been mine. There was none. Everything had been replaced, neat to the point of coldness. "The other room is small," Melissa continued, as if laying out a plan. "And there's no attached bathroom. Changing diapers, washing hands, it's all inconvenient. This space is much more practical." I swallowed hard. I knew the room she meant. It was more than 10 square meters, big enough for a crib, a wardrobe, and room to turn around. But I didn't say that. I only asked one question, my voice lower than I expected. "What about my workshop?" Melissa looked at me, her eyes sweeping the room as if reassessing the question. "Your things have all been moved to a rented storage unit," she answered. "It's clean, has cameras, and climate control. Leaving them here would just take up space." I stood still. "A rented storage unit?" "Yes," she nodded. "We're managing it for convenience." The words "managing it for convenience" landed lightly, but heavy enough to make my chest sink. I looked around one more time. The place where my father once stood, sharpening saw blades, where Helen sat sewing straight seams, now held only things that had nothing to do with us. I didn't see a workshop. I saw a new room built on top of what had been moved away. "You don't need to worry," Melissa added, her voice softening. "Everything's been carefully arranged." I didn't answer. I walked out of the room and down the stairs. Evan was still in the kitchen, his cereal bowl empty, the spoon resting crooked on the edge of the table. He looked at me, waiting, as if he already knew what I would say. "You think this is okay?" I asked. Evan let out a breath and leaned back in his chair. "Dad, we didn't really have a choice. The baby's coming. Melissa's right. That room makes more sense." "Makes sense for who?" "In general," he replied, avoiding my eyes. "You don't really use the workshop that much anymore anyway." I looked at my son. I remembered when he was small, running around my legs in the workshop, playing with sawdust, giggling every time his mother scolded him. I remembered thinking that place would be left to him one day, when I was no longer strong enough to stand long hours at the workbench. That thought vanished as quickly as the words had just been said. "You agreed to this?" I asked again. Evan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think it's a reasonable decision." I didn't say anything else. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, long enough to clearly hear the steady hum of the water. Purifier, the ticking of the clock advancing one beat at a time. I rested my hand on the back of the chair, leaned lightly, then asked the question I had known I would ask from the moment I stood at the workshop door. "That storage unit," I said, "whose name is on the contract?" Evan looked up. His eyes wavered for a brief moment before he answered. "Mine." Evan's answer landed on the kitchen table, heavy and final. "My name." 2 words, spoken evenly without anger or defensiveness, yet enough to make everything feel slightly off. I stood still, realizing my hand had clenched at some point. I didn't press him. I needed a brief moment to fully understand what that answer meant. "Where's the storage?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "An off-site rental unit," Evan replied, "near the highway. New place, cameras, climate-controlled. I keep the key." I nodded. Every added detail felt like another lock clicking into place on something that was already locked. My things were no longer in my house, and if I wanted to touch them, I had to go through my son. I said nothing more, just turned to grab my jacket. Evan watched, then looked at Melissa. She picked up her bag and walked out with us. The sun was harsher than when I'd come home. I drove following Evan's directions, Melissa in the back seat, occasionally staring out the window. After more than 20 minutes, we reached a row of storage units along the main road. Long gray buildings stretched evenly, a keypad gate at the entrance, a camera above, slowly panning. Evan punched in the code and the gate slid open. I parked, and the 3 of us got out and went inside. The hallway ran long fluorescent lights already on. Our footsteps echoed against the concrete, hollow and exposed. Evan stopped at one unit, pulled out a key and unlocked it. The metal door rolled up, the light inside snapping on. In front of me were cardboard boxes stacked neatly. Each one was sealed, labeled in black marker, orderly to the point of coldness. Tools, wood items, sewing fabric, miscellaneous. A few had an extra word underneath, old. "We organized it so it's easy to find," Evan said, like reporting a completed task. I stepped inside. The smell of paper, plastic, and new storage blended. I put my hand on a box and opened it. Inside were things so familiar I didn't need to look closely. The wrench set I'd used for decades. The wood chisels my father left me. Before, everything had its own place. Here they lay pressed together, wrapped in newspaper, stacked in layers. I moved farther in. In the back corner, I saw Helen's sewing machine. It was wrapped in thin nylon, set at an angle, no longer in the wooden case she had always protected it with. I bent down and placed my hand on the body of the machine. Cold. The sensation ran up through my fingertips. "This," I started, then stopped. Evan stood behind me, Melissa near the door. No one spoke. I straightened up, looked around once more. When I turned to the side, I noticed a stapled stack of papers on a metal shelf, slipped into a clear plastic folder. "What's this?" I asked. Melissa had been at the door. She stepped in and picked it up. "An inventory," she said, "so nothing gets lost and so we can find things when needed." I looked at the page. Item names, quantities, brief notes. I saw Helen's name appear on a few lines. Sewing machine, old, fabric scraps, thread box. The handwriting was even, straight, emotionless, like an inventory made when someone packs up the belongings of the dead. "You made this?" I asked. Melissa nodded. "Yes, easier to manage." "Manage," I repeated slowly. "Don't overthink it, Dad," she continued. "It's just temporary." I flipped through a few more pages. Near the end, several lines were crossed out. I asked, "What about these?" Melissa glanced over, hesitated slightly, then answered, "Oh, those items we didn't keep. It was too cramped to store everything." "Didn't keep?" I echoed. "There was a side table," she said quickly, "and some old rolls of fabric. We gave them away." I looked at her. "Gave them to who?" "A second-hand shop," she replied. They came and picked them up. Those things weren't being used anymore. Something hollow opened up in my head. That side table was where Helen laid out her sewing patterns. Those rolls of fabric she kept because she said, "You never know when you'll need them." They weren't valuable to anyone else, but to me, they were fragments of what remained. "Did you ask me?" I asked quietly. Melissa was silent for a beat. "We thought you didn't need them." Evan cut in, clearly trying to end it quickly. "You don't use that stuff anymore, Dad." The word slipped out, unshaped. Evan realized it immediately, but it was too late. I turned and looked at my son. I didn't see malice in his eyes. I saw convenience, the kind of convenience that lets people discard anything that doesn't fit their present needs. I took a deep breath and looked around the unit one last time. Everything was here, but not on my terms. I couldn't open it without Evan. I couldn't take anything without going through him. I stood among my own possessions like a guest in someone else's space. "Close it," I said. Evan pulled the door down. The metal hit the ground with a dry clang. He locked it and slipped the key into his pocket. I watched the motion, memorizing every detail. I went home in silence. No one asked anything further. Evan drove ahead. Melissa followed with her eyes constantly on her belly, as if the pregnancy were a waiver card for every decision just made. I walked into the bedroom, changed clothes, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The familiar house suddenly felt cramped in a very different way, not because of furniture, but because boundaries had been erased. Evan and his wife had been living in my house for 4 years, rent purely symbolic. I had thought that was enough to keep the family at peace. I opened the drawer and took out my phone. The contacts showed names I rarely needed to use. Daniel Wright was there, right at the top of the list. I pressed call. Daniel picked up fairly quickly. "Frank, I need to see you," I said. "Today." His tone shifted immediately. "What's going on?" "My house," I replied. "The workshop was altered while I was away. Furniture was moved. The storage contract is in my son's name." There was a brief silence on the other end, long enough for me to know he was connecting the dots. "Come to my office," Daniel said. "I'll be waiting." Daniel's office was downtown, on the second floor of an old building. I parked, went up the stairs, and stepped into the familiar room that smelled of paper and coffee. Daniel poured me a glass of water and sat across from me, pen already resting on a file. "Start from the beginning," he said. I told him everything. I left out no details. The brand new lock. The room turned into a daycare. Helen's belongings were boxed up and sent to an off-site storage unit. The inventory list. Items were given away because they were in the way. Daniel took notes, occasionally looking up to ask a short question for clarification. When I finished, he set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. "Legally," Daniel said, "you are the homeowner. They altered the living space without your consent. They relocated property that belongs to you and placed it under a contract, not in your name. That is a violation." I nodded, but I didn't feel any lighter. "What do I need to do?" "The first step," Daniel replied, "is to set a clear boundary. If they do not restore the property and return your belongings, you have the right to terminate the living arrangement. In other words, issue an eviction notice." I looked straight at him. "Draft it." Daniel frowned. "Frank, I have to ask. That's your son." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I'm sitting here." He was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. 30 days, Daniel said. "By regulation. I'll prepare the paperwork." When I got home, Evan was in the living room. He stood up when he saw me, his face tense, as if he had already guessed what I was about to say. "Where did you go, Dad?" he asked. "To see a lawyer," I replied without hedging. Evan froze. "A lawyer?" I placed the stack of papers Daniel had just printed on the table. "An eviction notice," I said. 30 days. Evan picked it up, his eyes scanning each line. His hand trembled slightly. "You're really doing this?" "I need my house back," I replied. "And what belongs to me?" Melissa appeared in the doorway, slowing when she saw the papers in Evan's hand. She skimmed them, then looked up, her eyes reddening. One hand went back to her belly, the familiar gesture used at the right moment. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking, "I'm pregnant. Are you going to throw us out onto the street?" "I'm giving you 30 days, I answered, "not kicking you out overnight." "You know what the housing market is like right now," Melissa continued. "Do you want your grandchild to be born into that?" Evan cut in, his voice urgent. "Dad, we can talk this through again. We don't need to bring the law into it." I looked at my son. "The law was brought into it when you signed the storage contract in your name," I said, "when my workshop was turned into something else while I wasn't there." Melissa shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "What will people think of you?" she said, "throwing your son and pregnant daughter-in-law out of the house?" The words hung in the room like a warning. I understood their weight very well. Neighbors, family, community, the looks. I had lived long enough to know people preferred judging to understanding. "I'm not throwing anyone out," I said. "I'm asking for everything to be put back where it belongs." Evan set the papers down and exhaled. "If we restore the workshop?" "Everything," I replied. "Back to its original state. My belongings returned to their original places. Then we'll talk." Melissa turned away without answering. I knew the answer was already there. That night, I packed a few sets of clothes into a bag. I didn't want to stay any longer. Not out of fear, but because I needed distance to keep a clear head. I drove out to the main road and stopped at a hotel near the highway. After checking in, I sat in the car for a few more minutes, watching the lights reflect on the windshield. I carried the bag up to the room and set it down beside the bed. The room was small, clean, and smelled of fresh sheets. I sat down and leaned back against the wall. In my mind, the workshop appeared again. The inventory list, the shiny new lock. I knew I had just crossed a line, and from here on out, nothing was going to be easy anymore. The next morning, I went back to the house to pick up a few documents I had left behind. The air was cooler than the night before, a breeze moving through the trees in the front yard. I parked the car, stepped out, and had just locked the door when I heard a voice from across the street. "Frank?" I turned. Mrs. Caldwell stood on her porch, a coffee mug in her hand. She had lived here a few years longer than I had, the type who knew every household's routine, who worked which shift, whose kids went to which school. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on my face longer than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I mean, have you been feeling tired lately?" The question was asked gently, but her choice of words made me pause. I nodded and said I was fine. Mrs. Caldwell nodded too, but the smile did not fully return. As I turned away, I heard her add one more line. "If anything's going on, you can tell me." I walked toward the door, an odd sensation following every step. Inside, everything was quiet, as usual. I went up to the study and rummaged through the drawer for my tax files. When I came back down, the doorbell rang. I opened the door. A young woman stood there wearing a polo shirt with the Homeowners Association logo. She held a clipboard and spoke politely. "Hello, Mr. Frank. I'm here for a routine check-in at the HOA's request. Do you have a few minutes?" "A check-in for what?" I asked. "Just checking on you," she replied. "Do you need any assistance, such as security concerns, anyone entering your home while you're away, or anything making you feel unsafe?" I looked straight at her. "Who requested this?" She glanced down at her clipboard, avoiding my eyes. "We received a report from residents." "Which residents?" "I'm not at liberty to say." I let her finish her scripted pleasantries and saw her out. As soon as the door closed, I stood still for a moment, clearly hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. I had never missed trash day, never left doors open. I lived alone, but not carelessly. At noon, I went to my usual grocery store. The young cashier, who normally greeted me with nothing more than a nod, studied me more closely today. As he rang me up, he asked, "Do you want me to write down a reminder of when to go home for you?" "I can remember on my own," I said. He gave an awkward smile. Yes, I was just asking. On the way back, I saw a strange man standing in front of my house, phone in hand. He looked at me and asked bluntly, "Do you know what day it is today?" I stopped. "Who are you?" "I'm a friend of Melissa," he said quickly. "She asked me to stop by and see if you're doing okay." That sentence landed softly, but it was enough for me to understand everything. I closed the gate, went inside, and locked it. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed both hands on the surface. The small pieces clicked together into a very clear picture. Rumors do not spread loudly. They move through questions that sound like concern, through probing looks, through people who just stop by to check. Melissa did not need to speak out loud. She only needed to plant it in the right places. I called Daniel. "Do you have time to talk?" I asked. "I do," he said. "What's going on?" "Melissa is telling the neighbors that I'm mentally declining," I said flatly. "The HOA came by. A stranger asked me the date. I want to know what their next move is." On the other end, Daniel let out a long breath. "Frank," he said slowly, "that's the groundwork. Once enough people believe it, they'll say you need someone to manage things for you. Temporary guardianship, power of attorney, and then your house, your accounts, your decisions," he replied. "Everything can be taken out of your hands while still being called legal." I tightened my grip on the phone. "So you're saying they're preparing?" Daniel was silent for a beat. Then he said, his voice firm, "They're preparing a legal robbery." I came home in the late afternoon when the sun had softened. A strange car was parked tight against the curb in front of the gate. Black, polished plates from outside the district. I paused for a beat, watching. I knew this feeling, the sense that someone had stepped into my story without asking permission. In the living room, Evan was sitting straighter than usual. Melissa stood by the window, a hand resting on her belly. Between them was a man I had never met. He was a little over 60, neatly cut gray hair, a pressed shirt, clean leather shoes. When he saw me, he stood and held out his hand. "Frank," he said, his voice low and measured. "I'm Harold, Melissa's father." I looked at the offered hand for a second, then took it. The grip was firm enough, the kind people use to establish balance in a room. "I hear there's been a misunderstanding," Harold went on, "so I came to clear things up." "My house," I said. "There's no misunderstanding." He smiled and pulled out a chair to sit. "We're all adults," he said. "A family living together for 4 years, there's give and take. Nobody does anything for nothing." It was said very smoothly. Not an accusation, not a plea. Just a reminder about time. As if 4 years were enough to turn ownership into entitlement. "I don't deny the time," I said. "I deny how they used it." Harold nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Melissa is pregnant," he continued. "Evan is your son. The community will look at this. What do you think people will say when they hear this story?" His gaze drifted past me and landed on the wedding photo on the wall. I understood. The pressure didn't need to be spoken outright. It hung there, enough to make a man weigh himself. "What are you here as?" I asked. "A mediator," Harold said, "and someone who doesn't want a family matter to turn into a lasting scar." I leaned back in my chair. "Then be clear," I said. "My conditions are simple." All 3 of them looked at me. "The workshop has to be returned to its original state," I said. "Every item, every position. Helen's things go back where they were. The off-site storage ends. When that's done, we can talk about time." Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but Harold raised a hand to stop her. He looked at me, his expression hardening. "You're making demands that are too rigid," he said. "That room has been renovated. Money has been spent. Time invested." "Not my money," I said, "and not my decision." Evan cut in, his voice low. "Dad, putting it back the way it was now is really hard." "I know," I said, "but that's the line." Harold leaned forward. "You should think more broadly," he said. 4 years here, they also contributed, kept the house, took care of things. You can't act like they never existed." Existence, I said, doesn't equal the right to occupy. The air in the room thickened. Melissa lowered her head, her hand pressing more tightly against her belly. Harold let out a breath, like a man who had tested a move and found his opponent unmoved. So you won't budge. I've been budging for 4 years, I said. Enough. Harold stood. He adjusted his cuff, his tone returning to polite. I understand. Then we'll consider our options. Consider all you like, I said. I'm waiting for action. He nodded, turned to Evan. We'll talk later. Then walked out the door. Melissa followed without looking back. Evan stayed a moment longer, then left the room as well. The door closed. I sat alone, staring at the space they left behind. I had given my terms, clear, final. And when I heard the engine start outside, I already knew the answer. That morning the sky was clear, the breeze light. I opened the kitchen window for air and made coffee, everything feeling like an ordinary day. Exactly 10 minutes to 9, the sound of a car stopping at the gate rang out, slow and deliberate. I looked out, a neat silver car. Behind it stood a man in a dark uniform, posture straight, holding a thin folder of documents. Walking beside him was Daniel. The gate opened. The two of them walked in, their steps even, unhurried. Only seconds later, nearby doors quietly cracked open. Curtains trembled slightly. Some people leaned against their porches. Some held up their phones. The community worked that way. No invitation needed. They still came. Daniel stopped at the steps and gave a very brief greeting. The uniformed man stepped forward. He read my name, read the address, then opened the folder. Each sentence was read clearly, loud enough for those around to hear. A lawful eviction notice, a deadline of 30 days, an obligation to restore the property to its original condition, a list of assets illegally relocated, attached as an appendix. The front door flew open. Melissa appeared, one hand on her belly, eyes already red. Evan followed, his face drained of color. One look was enough to know they had been waiting for this moment. Melissa stepped onto the porch, her voice breaking. The crying burst out quickly, loudly, enough to carry past the fence, enough to draw every gaze. She said she was pregnant. She said she was being thrown out onto the street. She spoke about the child soon to be born. Every sentence was chosen to strike what people were most ready to believe. A few murmurs rose. Some shook their heads. Some sighed. I stood still, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Their eyes slid past me, paused briefly, then turned back to the one who was crying. In that moment, the roles had already been assigned. Daniel stepped forward, keeping just enough distance. He produced another set of papers and explained briefly. Renovations done while the owner was absent. Property moved without consent. A storage contract under someone else's name. Everything was stated in an even voice, no arguing, no commentary. The uniformed man handed the folder toward Evan. Instructions to sign and acknowledge receipt. Evan took the pen, his hand shaking, signed, then let it drop as if he had just set down something hot. Melissa kept crying, turning toward the neighbors, searching for sympathy. Some people stepped closer, some stayed farther back, protecting themselves. I clearly heard a few scattered remarks. How could they do this to a pregnant woman? Family matters, and they bring the law into it. That man looked so harsh. Each sentence was like a small cut, not deep, but many. Daniel flipped to the final page and pointed at the timeline. The uniformed man nodded in confirmation. The procedure ended neatly. No shouting back and forth. No drawn-out arguments. Just signatures, stamps, and a crowd passing judgment silently in their own minds. When the two men left, people still lingered in the front yard. Melissa sobbed a while longer, then went back inside. Evan stood in the doorway, avoiding my gaze. I closed the door, the sound of the lock, sharp and dry. The house returned to silence. I set the coffee cup in the sink and washed my hands for a long time. The feeling of being watched like a villain still hung there, clinging. I knew it would follow me to the market, to the street. into every question disguised as concern. The phone vibrated on the kitchen table. An unknown number. I picked up. On the other end was a crisp voice, the kind that belonged to someone who worked strictly by procedure. The bank. They informed me that a transaction had just been flagged by the system as unusual. It involved the account of one person I knew. They needed immediate confirmation. I held the phone close to my ear, took a short breath, and said I was listening very clearly. On the other end, the voice paused for a beat, then continued reading out the transaction details. The voice on the other end of the line dropped lower, slower. The bank representative read out every number, every timestamp, as if afraid I might miss a single detail. My brother's account. One transfer made while he was lying in the hospital, then another transfer 2 days later. The total amount was large enough for the system to automatically flag it and call for verification. I leaned my hand against the window ledge. Outside, a few neighbors were still scattered around, talking quietly to one another. Sunlight slanted through the trees. Everything looked so normal it was almost unbelievable. I asked only one question: where the money had gone. The person read out the recipient account name. They read it very clearly. I heard my last name first, then a familiar given name. Evan's name. There was a moment of emptiness in my head, like standing in the middle of a room that has just been cleared out, not yet understanding what I have lost. Then everything crashed in at once. 3 weeks in the hospital. I signed documents for my brother. I ran back and forth between the pharmacy counter, the intensive care unit, the parking lot. I had asked Evan to help Carol reinstall the banking app on her phone because she was not comfortable using it. I had thought it was a small thing. One login, one bit of help. The bank representative's voice pulled me back. The transaction times matched the day my brother was wheeled into surgery. The login location matched the area where I was at that time, but the device was different. They asked whether I had authorized anyone else to access the account. I looked down at my hands that had signed hundreds of documents in my life, hands that had believed family was the safest place. I said I had not authorized any transfer. I said my brother had not been lucid enough at that time to confirm anything. The representative made notes. They said they would temporarily freeze any further transactions. They asked if I wanted to file a fraud complaint. I said yes, immediately. When the call ended, the kitchen was completely silent. I stood still for a few more seconds, as if to make sure the floor was still there. Then I sat down at the table, elbows resting on the surface. The pieces had now clicked into a complete picture, painfully clear. The trip to care for my brother, the workshop locked while I was away, the belongings moved out, the rumors about memory loss, the inventory list, the warehouse contract in Evan's name, and now the money. Not an impulsive act, a whole chain. I called Carol. She picked up right away, her voice tired but still warm. I asked whether she had checked the account recently. She said no. Since my brother's surgery, she had let me handle the paperwork. I told her about the transfer. On the other end, she was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was trembling. That money was for recovery, for medication, for the months he would not be able to work. I listened, my throat going dry. I apologized. I said I would take care of it. I called the bank again, requesting copies of the transactions, the IP addresses, the authentication times. I wrote everything down, every number, every line, like hammering another nail into the truth I had been avoiding for so long. Dusk fell. Outside, the neighbors had dispersed. I stood up and walked into the living room. The house was still my house, but the familiar feeling had changed. I no longer had doubts. I had enough to understand this did not stop at the boundary of family. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. When he answered, I said it plainly. My brother's money was transferred while he was in the hospital. The receiving account belonged to Evan. I heard him let out a heavy breath. "Frank," he said, "this goes beyond a civil matter." I looked up at the ceiling where the yellow light spread evenly. I said I knew, and I needed the next step. Daniel told me to keep all documents, all messages, all call logs intact. Tomorrow morning he would go with me. We would file the case, not to intimidate, to protect. I set the phone down and sat back at the kitchen table. The anger did not explode. It settled, thick and heavy, like something that had been waiting there all along. I knew from this moment on the story would shift its axis, and this time it would not be just lawyers getting involved. The next morning I arrived at Daniel's office earlier than usual. The air was still cold, a thin layer of dew clinging to the car windows. Daniel was already waiting, his coat neatly draped over the back of the chair, his desk more bare than normal, as if he knew it needed space for something else today. We skipped small talk. I placed the stack of papers on the desk. Bank statements, transaction timelines, login locations, call records with the bank. Daniel opened each page, reading slowly, marking certain lines with a pencil. The more he read, the harder his expression became. The fraud complaint was filed that same morning. Wake County's Financial Investigations Unit received the file that day. I sat in the waiting chair, watching people move back and forth, listening to the steady hum of the printer. The atmosphere there was nothing like my living room the day I handed over the documents. Here, emotion decided nothing. Only data did. At midday, an investigator called me into an office. Bright wooden desk, hard chairs, white overhead lights. They asked about my trip to care for my brother, who had access to the devices, who knew the passwords. I answered each question, no more, no less. I told them about asking Evan to help install an app for Carol, about the time my brother went into surgery, about spending entire days at the hospital. They placed a printout in front of me, access history, multiple logins from the same area but different devices, a series of money transfer confirmation emails opened in the early morning hours, while my brother was in intensive care. The recipient account matched Evan's name. The IP address traced back to my house. I sat still, not because I was surprised, but because everything had now been arranged into clean, orderly rows, like an inventory list in a warehouse. The investigator asked if I recognized the backup email used for account recovery. I did immediately. It was the email Evan had used back in college. In the afternoon, they moved on to the part involving Melissa. Access logs showed several transaction confirmations open on her device. No transfers, but opened, marked as read. Messages between the two appeared in the backup records, talking about the first step. 3 months later, the formal trial would take place, once the digital evidence had been examined and procedures completed. The courtroom. My name listed as the primary witness. I read each line carefully, folded the paper, and placed it in the drawer with the prepared file. The following days passed slowly and heavily. Evan's lawyer contacted me once, asking a few procedural questions, carefully avoiding mention of money. Daniel told me to preserve all evidence, have no private discussions, no meetings. The night before the trial, I slept very little, not out of fear, but because every detail of the past years automatically lined itself up in my mind, as if waiting to be spoken in the right place, at the right time. The next morning, I put on my coat, locked the door, and stepped outside. This time I knew exactly where I was going, and that was the morning I walked into the courtroom. That morning I arrived at the courthouse, earlier than the scheduled time. The sky was gray, a light drizzle falling. The lobby was wide, the ceiling high, footsteps echoing into a steady rhythm. I sat on a wooden bench, hands resting on my thighs, back straight. No one asked anything. No one needed to. My name was already in the file as a witness. A side door opened. 2 officers entered first. Evan followed, both wrists locked in cold metal. The clothes he had worn when leaving the house the day the documents were served had been replaced with a pale prison uniform. His face had thinned faster than I expected. His eyes swept the courtroom, met mine for a brief moment, then turned away. There was no plea for help, only belated shock. Melissa sat behind him, her pregnant belly clearly pronounced. Her father was beside her, back straight, lips pressed tight. Both remained silent. The other rows gradually filled. People came to watch a trial, but also to witness a family collapse in an orderly fashion. The prosecutor stood when the judge entered. The voice was even, clear, each timeline stacked like bricks. 4 years living there with token rent, altering the space while the owner was absent, relocating personal property, creating an inventory list, a storage contract under another name, spreading rumors of cognitive decline to lay groundwork for guardianship. Then came the money. A chain of transactions appeared on the screen. Dates and times matched the surgery. An IP address from my house. A different device. Confirmation emails opened at dawn. The receiving account in Evan's name. Every detail supported by documents. No speculation required. When my name was called, the room went quiet. I stepped up, placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. I recounted the trip to care for my brother, asking for help installing an app, the days at the hospital, the workshop locked while I was away, the off-site storage, the list of belongings, the neighbors' concerned questions. I added no emotion. I simply put each fact where it belonged. The defense attorney tried to redirect. Family pressure, confusion, good intentions. I answered briefly. Intent does not change consequences. Confusion does not create a matching data trail. When I stepped down, Evan lowered his head. The metal at his wrists clinked softly. That sound rang clearer than any defense. The judge instructed the prosecutor to read the conclusions again. The legal language was chosen carefully, but the meaning was unmistakable. Exploitation of an elderly person, electronic fraud, violation of property rights, conspiracy through false information. Family honor was mentioned once like a marginal note, then set aside. The hearing recessed for deliberation. I remained seated, staring at the relief on the wall ahead. It once symbolized justice. Today it was just a silent wall, waiting for judgment. When the judge returned, everyone stood. I stood as well, back still straight. Evan was brought forward. Melissa clenched her hands, eyes red but dry. Her father stared straight ahead without blinking. The judge's voice was low, slow. The sentence would be announced immediately after the final assessment. I heard every word, yet felt as though I were standing outside my own body. Everything had reached the point of no return. The gavel struck, the sound landed clean and final, and I knew that in just a few seconds, a single number would decide what remained of that boy's life. The sentence was handed down on a windy afternoon. I don't remember exactly which words the judge used to arrive at the final number. I only remember the moment Evan was led out of the courtroom, his wrists still cuffed, his steps slowing as he passed by me. His eyes swept over, paused for a very brief beat, then slid away. No more arguments, no more excuses, only the outcome. 3 years in prison, long enough for everything to change. Melissa stood up later than everyone else. Her belly was large, her steps careful. Her father said something very softly, then reached out to support her. The two of them left the courtroom before the reporters could squeeze in. I heard a few half-finished questions, a few cameras raised and then lowered. The family story had reached the end of its curiosity. What remained was just consequence. The divorce process went faster than I expected. No property disputes, no fighting over the house. Melissa moved back to her parents' place in the suburbs, taking the newborn child with her. They chose silence. The people who once stood in front of my house on the day the papers were served now lowered their heads when they saw me. Some avoided my eyes. Some pretended to be busy. Reputation in the neighborhood fell as fast as a curtain dropping. The chat group that once worried about my memory disappeared. The homeowners association sent a short apology email saying they had misunderstood the information. I read it and didn't reply. Some things, when they come too late, don't need an answer. I went back home and started with the workshop. The new lock had been removed. The door opened, and the familiar smell rushed in. Wood, machine oil, fine dust clinging to the shelves. I stood at the threshold for a long while, then stepped inside. Each box was brought back from the rented storage. I opened them one by one, putting everything back in its old place. My father's chisels went up first. Wrenches were arranged by size. The lathe was leveled again. I worked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I needed this feeling. Helen's sewing machine was placed back in its usual corner. I wiped the body with a soft cloth, plugged it in, tested a short run. The machine hummed evenly, no missed rhythm. I stood there, my hand resting on the table, letting the sound fill the emptiness. In the days that followed, I lived by the old schedule. Morning coffee, midday in the garden, afternoon in the workshop. No one checked in. No one stopped by. The house slowly returned to its original shape, not because of the furniture, but because the boundaries had been restored. One afternoon, as I was reorganizing a drawer, the doorbell rang. The mail carrier stood there, holding out a gray envelope with a prison stamp in the corner. I signed for it, took it, feeling heavier than paper. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and set it on the table. Sat for a while, then opened it. The handwriting was familiar, shakier than before. Evan wrote that he had started therapy sessions, wrote that for the first time he was forced to take responsibility for what he had done, wrote that he understood many things too late. No request for forgiveness, no demands, just telling. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight slanted through the workshop window, illuminating the workbench. I knew this story wasn't over. It had only shifted into another chapter. And I understood that consequence isn't loud punishment. It is each person having to go on living with what they chose. I read the letter again the next morning. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, fell across the table, touched the trembling lines of handwriting. Evan wrote a lot about learning to take responsibility. He wrote about therapy sessions, about the feeling of having to finally face consequences head-on for the first time. There were no pleas, no excuses, just an account of long days and a late awakening. I folded the letter and set it aside. The emotion did not erupt. It stayed still, heavy and clear. I understood that a letter of remorse was not a ticket that erased what had happened. It was only a step, and that step came last, after everything had already been paid for. At noon, I sat down at my desk and took out paper and pen. I wrote back to Evan. Not long, not ornate. I said I had read his letter. I said that I saw his beginning to acknowledge things as necessary. I said plainly that I was not ready to forgive. Forgiveness is not a gift given because of feelings, but the result of a long process, where actions must come before words. I made one thing clear. Consequences are mandatory. There are no shortcuts, no way around them. I said that if he continued to do the right things, continued to take responsibility, then the door to dialogue would open a small crack, not wide, not fast, but it would exist. I signed my name, folded the letter, and put it into an envelope. In the afternoon, I took the letter to the post office. On the way back, I stopped by the hardware store, bought more light bulbs, a few small items. I was not in a hurry. I chose carefully, the way I used to when things were still calm. When night fully fell, I opened the workshop door, flipped the switch. Light poured out, even and warm. I stood in the middle of the room, looking at each corner returned to its proper place. The workbench straight, the tool shelves aligned, Helen's sewing machine in its familiar corner, covered with a clean cloth. I placed my hand on the tabletop, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingertips. This feeling needed no explanation. I began to work, slowly, carefully. The machine hummed steadily, unhurried. Every movement had its reason. I worked until my hands were tired, then stopped, shut off the machine, stepped back to look again. The lights were still on. The space was quiet in a comfortable way. I locked the workshop and stepped into the house. In the living room, everything was tidy. No more probing looks. No more questions pretending to care. I made tea and sat down, letting the heat warm my hands. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees, leaves rustling softly. I thought about doors. Some doors need to be shut tight to keep things safe. Some doors should not be closed completely, but also cannot be thrown wide open. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the condition that allows any relationship to have a chance to exist. I stood up, walked through the house, turned off the lights room by room, leaving only the light from the workshop spilling onto the porch. From the outside, the house looked ordinary. To me, it had returned to what it was meant to be. I locked the front door, slipped the key into my pocket, stood still for a beat, and then turned back inside. This is my house, and at last, I'm living as its owner. The story ends here. I tell it not to justify myself, but to make one thing clear. Boundaries only exist when we dare to hold on to them. Some prices are very high, but necessary for everything to return to its proper place. If you are still listening, leave a dot, so I know you are here. If you want to follow the next stories, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening until the final minute.